Hi, everybody, and welcome to our online Bible study. It's good that we can be together. Today, we're going to continue our study on the entire Bible. We're in the book of Ephesians today, and right off the bat, I want you not to miss what this important book of the Bible is about. Remember, this is a field guide for spotting Jesus in every book of the Bible. So what we're doing is we're going through and book by book and seeing how each one of these books isn't just a work on its own, but it actually fits into a whole story with Jesus at the center of it all. All right, so we're going on. We're taking a look at Ephesians, and we call this one, the theme of Ephesians is God's story in your life. And I think that's really important because Ephesians has really two big components of it, where Paul's going to break down what God's story exactly is, and then the other side of that is how it relates into your life and mine. Let's take a look at Ephesians. First of all, it's a huge city, the city of Ephesus. It's a really, really big deal. Epicenter for worship for most Greek and Roman gods. The city of Ephesus, when Paul was there, it's like a really, really hyper spiritual city. And I'm not sure like how to relate that to today, like what the equivalent of that might be. I don't even know. So if you have a comment or if you have maybe a help, drop it in the comment section below. Talk about it in your group. I just don't know what it would be today, what that really, really spiritual city would be today. I know internationally, it would be something like, I don't know, Mecca maybe, Jerusalem, but really a city that's not just well known in one particular region, but a city that has people from all over, various religions that all identify. It's just people that really look into a lot of religions. So really, really spiritual city. Christianity is no exception of that. As Paul plants his church there, there's lots of people who become really authentic, really genuine Christians as well. He spent about 2.5 years there planting the church in Ephesus. Maybe you can think about this as like a collection of house churches rather than just like one big church building. We can learn more about it in the book of Acts chapter 19. Let's jump into the book. Like what is Ephesians about? Remember, two big components of it. There's Ephesians 1-3. The first half is God's story, and then the second half of this whole thing is going to be your story. So let's see, opening up Ephesians 1-3, the God story. It opens with this really, really cool poem about how grace changes everything. And then we see that God has this plan for his family. The plan was to be a unified family. It wasn't just for the Jewish people. It was really for everybody. It was like that since the beginning of time. Paul is like laying this down. We see like creation, and then Abraham is really, really central to the book of Ephesians. And then Jesus, of course, brings it all in through forgiveness, through grace. Jesus kind of wraps his arm around all of humanity. He uses some language that I think is kind of important. When he says we, he usually means the Jewish people. When he says you, he usually means the non-Jewish or Gentile people. When he says us, he means his covenant family. Everybody who identifies with Jesus and his death and resurrection. When he says us, he's talking about everybody that God made his family through forgiveness and through grace. It's cool that in this opening poem, he lays some of these seeds for what we know today as the Trinity, where he references God the Father, God the Son, Jesus, and then the Spirit, all working together to accomplish this new multi-ethnic family of God, all working together. And then after the poem, there's this really, really, really good line that he's praying to God in conclusion of this poem, and he's praying that they, us, wouldn't just know about God, but experience the presence and the power of God. That's important, that we today, thousands of years later, that we would not just know things about God, but that we would actually experience the presence and the power of God. Guys, at Encounter Church, that's why we named the church Encounter, that you wouldn't just know things about God, that you would experience something here, that you would experience the power and the presence of God. The same Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead also lives in you and I. And then there's this really important word where he says, therefore, and it's probably one of the biggest therefores in the Bible. Oftentimes we see, in the Bible, like, what's it? the word therefore, you got to ask yourself, what's it there for? It's a good way to read the Bible. But this is one of the really important ones because it kind of hinges the two sides of Ephesians together. Where on the one hand you have God's story, and then therefore, Ephesians 4-6, is your story. So the therefore is the hinge that's hanging it all together. Now it's this challenge to the reader to respond to the gospel, to show how they live their lives in light of that story. So Paul's saying, listen, now that you've experienced something, presumably, how does your life change as a result? He talks about how we're one in chapter 4, one body, one spirit, one Lord, one baptism, one God the Father above all. There's unity in the one, but then he kind of switches it and he pivots and said, okay, but unity is not the same as uniformity. That's really important. And he uses the examples of God gave some to be apostles and some prophets, some teachers, some pastors, some evangelists. Unity is not the same as uniformity. Guys, the church today could hear this, right? We could hear this again because we kind of become like bifurcated and separated. Each church has its own little pocket according to what's important to them or what maybe their preferences might be. Unity is not the same as uniformity. We don't always have to dress the same way or like the same kind of music or vote the same kind of way. Unity is not the same as uniformity. We've got to figure out a way to move forward together, even though we're not the same. And then there's we got to love each other. Love is the basis for that unity to build up the whole church. It's not a good idea. It's a God idea. All right, some of the metaphors behind this is he talks about a temple for a little bit, and then he goes into this really cool metaphor about this whole new humanity that God is creating, where it's like we have to take off the old humanity and put on the new humanity. And then it's like, what are you talking about? Like a pair of clothes we slip into a new humanity? Well, yeah, that's kind of what he says. That's where he's going. And he talks about the humanity that you're taking off and the humanity that you're putting on. He gives us some of these examples. He goes, okay, so instead of lying, you're going to take that off and you're going to put on truth. Instead of anger, you're going to take that off and you're going to put on peace. Instead of stealing and gossip and revenge, instead of promiscuity, we're going to put on self-control. Instead of drunkenness, we're going to put on the influence of the Spirit. This is like just some examples. It's not an exhaustive list, but this is how it works. What are we taking off? What are we putting on? I think it's probably worth each one of us as Jesus followers to take a moment and saying, all right, where is maybe God asking me to take off my old humanity to put on the new one in light of the story of God? Maybe for you and me, maybe it's a good thing to look at this list and say, okay, which one of these in particular, they're all good, could I grow into? Which one could I take off a little bit more fully or a little bit more completely? And then what am I replacing it with? Because it's not enough just to take off lying. We're putting on the truth. He gives some signs of the Spirit. Singing together is a sign of the Spirit. Singing alone is a sign of the Spirit. I love just how practical this whole thing is. Being thankful. And then a big one is elevating others as more important than ourselves, like kind of deferring and building each other up and highlighting the work of God in other people. And he says this is really, really clear in how Christian households should run. And he gives a very controversial take in some circles, I think often misunderstood, about what those instructions mean, because we have instructions for wives and we have instructions for husbands. Instructions for wives are around respecting your husband and allow him to fulfill that God-ordained responsibility in the marriage. Husbands, the demonstration of a household is to love your wives as Christ loved the church, is laying down of your life. I think it gets controversial probably because of the word submit that's in there. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit to your husbands. Husbands, love your wives. And we don't like that. We don't like the idea of submitting one bit, especially telling wives to submit to their husbands. But I think some of the controversy around that is probably a little bit over-exaggerated. The heading of that category in the Bible, Ephesians 5, I think 23, if you want to look it up, is submit to one another out of reverence to Christ. So it's just like we're all submitting to each other. That's how Christianity works. That's how the church works, is that we're constantly deferring to one another. We're constantly submitting to one another. So wives to your husbands, of course, we're all submitting to one another. And then husbands really get the tall order. And I get asked all the time about, what does it mean for husbands to lead their families? And man, we could do an entire show just on this, whole podcast. But the practical reality, I would say, is lead your household as Christ led the church. What did Jesus do? What's the one single greatest act that Jesus is remembered for? He allowed himself, he gave himself up completely and wholly out of love for the church, sacrifice, laying down of life. That's what it means to take off the old self, where you're like, oh, somebody's submitting to me, I could leverage that. No. Put on the new life. Husbands, love your wives to death. And I don't just mean in one grand act. I mean, love your wives to death every single day, every single moment. That's a tall order, right? What can you do today, husbands, to love your wives a little bit more fully? I mean, this is big. We see in the instructions that husbands, their action is really to mimic Jesus, right? So what does it mean for husbands to lead their households? Well, look at Jesus, right? And everything that he did for his bride, the church. And then the wife mimics the church, right? In all this. So, I mean, man, this is just, it's really deep stuff. It's really, really practical. And then he ends with his caution of saying, don't forget that evil is real, right? Don't forget, he's talking about unity and uniformity. Don't forget that divisions exist among us. That one of the chief tactics of the evil one is going to be to divide us. And that spiritual evil is really real, and you're going to have to defend yourselves from it. Okay, so I imagine him. This is kind of Dirk speculation, I guess, but I just imagine him. He's writing this in prison. He's writing this in chains, and I imagine him looking over and he's seeing a fully dressed Roman centurion, right? And he's identifying each one of these armored elements, right? And he's like conjuring up this imagery from Isaiah about the Messiah. And he's going, you're going to need to defend yourself, except for our struggle isn't against flesh and blood. Our struggle is against the rulers, the authorities, the cosmic powers of this of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces in the heavenly realm. So he's looking at it going, the defense and the body armor that you need isn't like a physical shield. The body armor you need is faith. The body armor that you need isn't a physical helmet. The body armor you need is to be fitted with righteousness. It isn't a breastplate, salvation. The breastplate isn't that. It's not made of metal. It's made of righteousness. The sword is the word of God. That's what you're going to go on the offensive. That's how you're going to attack evil in this world, this metaphorical spiritual evil, to be sure, not a person necessarily. Right? So he's like taking a very militaristic concept and he's turning it into this spiritual reality. And I think that's maybe sometimes where we get wrong, especially when we look, and I get asked all the time about the Old Testament and what is that stuff about these instructions towards violence in the Old Testament, and how do we reconcile that with the words of Jesus? Well, I always go to Ephesians 6:12, right? And saying, listen, remember, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, right? Our struggle is against the spiritual forces of evil in this world and in the heavenly realms. That's what our struggle is for. And so we don't fight this battle with guns and swords and shields and tanks. We fight this battle as Christians with faith, with salvation, with righteousness, with the word of God, with shoes fitted with the readiness of the gospel, etc. You can read all about that in Ephesians. All right, where do we see Jesus? Man, where don't we see Jesus in Ephesians? A couple final thoughts, I guess. The gospel says that Jesus conquered sin and brought peace. For those of you who have experienced the peace of God, you have the responsibility to demonstrate that peace to a broken world. This is not easy. Let's be sure of that. But remember that God has equipped you with supernatural, sin-breaking body armor, the armor of God. as we just heard about it. He gives you a tall order, but he equips you and I along the way. Some questions, and you can kind of reflect on these either on your own or in a group setting about the book of Ephesians. Who wrote it? Why was it written? I love this question. What's the difference between number 2, knowing about God and experience him? Have you really experienced the presence of God? Would you like to? Another one is this from chapter 4 is identify. Look at these. Where are you being encouraged by God today or challenged by God today to take off the old humanity? Lying, anger, theft, gossip, revenge, promiscuity, drunkenness. He names all of these. And then what are you going to replace it with this week? All right, I'm going to leave these questions on the screen for just a few moments. You can press pause if you want to just hang out on them a little bit longer. They're in the comment section below on YouTube. I'm so glad that you guys stopped by. We're going to see you again Wednesday at noon for our next Bible study, looking through the whole book of the Bible. Take care, everyone.